If we could, I'd like to now introduce our other panelists that have graciously joined us here for this event. And as it turns out, they all know each other for like a real long time. So it's a very small, coexisting trad world of unity. First guest is on the far side of Peter, on his left side. Gregory DiPippo is a native of Providence, Rhode Island. I don't know very many natives of Providence, but that's awesome. Look at that. Who returned to the United States last year after living in Rome for over 25 years. Since 2008, he has been a regular contributor to the website New Liturgical Movement, and since 2013, he's been its editor. His research covers a very wide range of topics, and one of his major fields of interest is the reforms of the Roman liturgy that took place in the years immediately preceding the Second Vatican Council. So we're happy to have Greg with us here tonight. And to my immediate left, Christopher Owens. Christopher is the executive officer for Veterum Sapientia Institute, which many folks here in Charlotte know about that. He completed his licentiate studies at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, the Angelicum, with a concentration in Thomistic studies, and is a doctoral candidate at the same university. He has both taught and served in administration and higher education, as well as worked in pastoral ministry and his administration at the parish and diocesan levels. His current research is on predestination in the Thomistic tradition, but he wrote his master's thesis on the liturgy as, auctoritas?
Auctoritas.
And there you go, auctoritas, in the theological argument. I'm sure many of you have done that as well. Christopher is an ordinary member of the Sacra Doctrina Project and has served in various board capacities, including the editorial board of Philosophical News, the official journal of the European Society for Moral Philosophy. He is vice president of the Albertus Magnus Center for Scholastic Studies, based in Norcia, Italy. And he was founding chairman of the board for Chesterton Academy of Sacramento. And he has been involved in the development of notable projects such as the Josiah and Luz Est. Josiah and Luz Est.
Jus et Justitium.
Thank you.
And the Josias.
Yes, website, which promotes tradition. He's an oblate of the monastery of St. Benedict in Norcia, Italy. We're friends of the diocese, and he's married with 5 children. So Chris Owens. And Peter, you already know, and I'm your moderator, Brian Williams. All right, so kind of wanted to start by just having touching upon a few points out of Peter's talk tonight, which I thought was outstanding, and we thank him for that. At one point, Peter, maybe a couple of times you mentioned the sensus fidei fidelium, and basically that it's the faithful possess that which belongs to and is in harmony with the faith. We kind of recognize that, what is right. We experientially, many of us here in this audience, we know that tradition is good. We know a solemn high mass is a beautiful thing, and that it is not divisive, or it's not a source of disobedience, and it's not dangerous. So I guess I'd kind of maybe just start our panel tonight with how do we refute those claims that the traditional liturgy, the traditional mass, that tradition is a source of danger for us? Yeah, Peter, do you want to start with that? Or?
I think it would be better to have Chris and Gregory speak, since I would.
Greg, if you want to go ahead and start with them.
Yeah, it's kind of silly, but I mean, it's just 2 words, Shia LaBeouf. I mean, you've all heard.
There you go.
I think you've heard about this. For those of you who haven't heard about this, that there's this young actor who's actually not that young anymore. He's been in Hollywood. He was in Hollywood from the time he was a teenager. No, you're younger than a teenager. He was actually in Disney movies. And this kid had a messed, by his own admission, really, really messed up life. He had an interview recently with Bishop Barron in which he described his sort of earlier life as depraved and on fire, and not when the way Bishop Barron uses on fire. So, and for him, because he was then cast in a role, and I would strongly urge you all to see this interview. It really is quite a thing, because he was cast in a role, and he said he took this role to play Padre Pio in a movie solely because he wanted to start his career up again, because he has behaved like a just terrible person. And again, I'm quoting him when I say this. And he took this role simply as a way of trying to jumpstart his career, and the experience of having to learn how to say the Mass that Padre Pio said brought him into the Catholic faith. You know, he was most of his life, he was bar mitzvahed when he was a kid, but you know, his family's not practicing. And this has brought about a tremendous conversion experience for him. So this is a man who, you know, has spent so much of his life living very, very far from the teachings of God, and now he is, happily practicing Catholic and very on fire to discover the faith. Oh, sorry about that. And so, a really wonderful testimony to the power of the traditional liturgy to convert souls. If we're going to talk about division, that the traditional liturgy creates division. Yes, it does. It creates division between a sinful life and the desire to live a holy life. So, I think that's just one of the best examples I can think of right away of the power of this. And I just, I can't see any personal justification for trying to deprive anybody of that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was wondering how many minutes into the panel was Shia LaBeouf going to be brought up. So good job right out the gate. Maybe put another way. And here I'll use a little philosophical language. Say that being is the first thing that falls into the intellect. It's when one comes into contact with truth himself, right? He who is the way, the truth, and the life. Then there doesn't need to be a judgment about it. One is able to joyfully just cling on to that. I think Peter referred to the sensus fidelium, and we could talk a lot about the deposit of faith as sort of this. I don't know. I find it ultimately unsatisfactory, and one day I want to write more about this. But ultimately it's a box, right? It's a box that contains. It's the deposit of faith. It's a box with stuff in it, and the stuff in it are those things which God has revealed that is necessary for salvation ultimately, but like coming to know and to love Him, and in this life in preparation for the next. And I think sort of one of the challenges that Peter's talk represented very well is, how do we know the deposit of faith and know it truly and without confusion or error? And I think that this is certainly the crisis of modern times in general, and more specifically in different ages. It takes different shapes. But I think that we in the first instance can have a great hope by virtue of our baptism, right? That through baptism we're given that virtue of faith. Which, as St. Thomas says, is unformed, and yet, we have the whole of our lives through which it becomes formed and perfected, such that we will no longer have faith but sight in heaven, right? And I think that, to echo Pope Benedict's first remarks on the Loggia there, right? To pray for me that I do not flee for fear of the wolves. This is something maybe we can internalize ourselves, knowing that we've got a firm foundation in our Catholic faith, bolstered and supported by good pastors in our local communities, and that which is promised and received through faith and hoped for will come to fruition in eternity. Yeah.
I would just add that our Lord Jesus Christ Himself did not seem to pursue unity at all costs. In quite the contrary, He said that He came to bring not peace but a sword, and to divide a man against his household. Not that He wanted that division to happen, but He knew it would happen because some people would follow Him and some people would reject Him. And so unity is not the highest good. The highest good is truth, and unity follows from adherence to the truth. Those who adhere to the truth are unified with each other. Paul says the same thing in letter to the Hebrews about the word of God is like a two-edged sword. It cuts sharper than any sword, right? And so it divides, right, unto the bone and marrow, or however exactly he puts it there. So it seems to me that just what is happening now is a classic scapegoating mechanism. So the real people who are destroying the unity of the church are those who are proponents of error and novelty and progressivism and modernism. Those are the ones who are actually causing division. But they need a scapegoat. They need to point at some group of people the way that the Germans pointed at the Jews, the Nazis, that is, pointed at the Jews and said, these are the people who are responsible for everything that's going wrong in Germany. And so similarly, what needs to happen with today's progressives and modernists is they need to find a group to blame for why the Vatican II era is not this prosperous, glorious era, but that it's full of clouds and darkness and so forth. And so it's just, as I say, classic scapegoating, along with classic gaslighting and Stockholm syndrome and all kinds of other things too. All those things.
The best things.
Yeah.
And all the other ones, yes. Sorry. So 50 years, you mentioned this in your talk tonight, Peter, and you kind of really gave us, I think, a challenge or a clarion call that let us be the traditionalists that the original traditionalists were, which I think is great because we have been kind of spoiled, I guess, and we are a little soft. You have to go back and kind of really learn that history of how they had it back in the 70s and 80s. But the fact that we're living now 50 years into this experiment, I guess, and how does that make this, how do we view now the Novus Ordo? How do we view the attempt to outlaw traditional Mass? You touched upon it just now a little bit, Peter, but with looking back on the last 50 years, how do we reassess both the Novus Ordo and the traditional Mass, knowing what we know now? I mean, that's kind of a broad question, but take it for what you want to do with it.
All right, that's my field. So, okay, I would say, first of all, in terms of how do we understand the Novus Ordo, there is no such thing as the Novus Ordo. There is a multiplicity of them. It was designed that way, and so. And so there's a lot of different factors that have to be taken into consideration. We live here in a diocese where the kinds of abuses that I grew up with, which were normative when I was a child, just don't exist here. And so Italy has followed the exact opposite trajectory. The Novus Ordo I lived there for 25 years. The Novus Ordo got palpably worse as I was, over the years that I was there. There was a complete disintegration. You might have seen that this summer there was this bizarre episode of a priest who, wearing nothing but a bathing suit, celebrated Mass standing in the ocean, celebrating the Mass on a floatable, an inflatable mattress, inflatable, water flotation device, like Indicom mattress in Italian. And Roberto De Mattei rightly pointed out, he said, this is the sign of just complete and absolute lack of preparation in terms of, liturgy that has taken over the seminaries there. Here we really have seen the opposite trajectory. One of the other things that, when I first went to Rome, you didn't really see American seminarians coming to the traditional Mass. Over time, you saw more and more of them. They participated. The very first Mass that was celebrated at Trinità Pellegrini, the Fraternity of St. Peter got a parish in Rome. The subdeacon was an American seminarian. That would have been unthinkable when I first went there. So it's a different situation in different places. That in and of itself is a problem. If the purported idea behind Traditionis Custodes was we need unity within the church, then Novus Ordo was the last thing that you would pitch on to create unity in the church. It was designed to be different from one church and one diocese and one country to the next. So there is also the issue, which is, and I'm not going to bore you with the details, but it is also certainly true. We now know from the research of a lot of people that a lot of the scholarship that led to the creation of the Novus Ordo has been totally debunked. And I'll just give you one very simple example, which is that the whole theory and the whole historical sort of construct on which the Second Eucharistic Prayer was instituted. I mean, nobody defends it anymore. Absolutely nobody. And in fact, there's a person in this room right now who actually taught me that. So my boss, Dr. Eric Hewitt, wrote a really great paper about this a long time ago. So, and even people who are 100% in favor of the new rite would not defend any longer the theory behind what the second Eucharistic prayer actually is. And then in terms of the reassessment of the traditional liturgy, it's easier to say, which is simply that it is certainly true that prior to the council, there was a lot of slackness about it in a lot of places. People do not let a thing go so lightly if they value it. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of people simply did not value the traditional liturgy. What has taken place in the church with the first Ecclesia Dei and then Summorum Pontificum is that a lot of people have rediscovered the value of it, have rediscovered its beauty. There's been a lot of really good research into the significance of its texts and its rites, and nothing is going to bury that, because now there's the internet.
Yeah, so the question started with, well, what are you to do, right?
Yep.
And, actually, between all of us, we've all lived a lot of places. One of the principles about judging action is that morals is a practical science where the same principles could arrive at different conclusions in different circumstances. And so I think that one has to judge and make a judgment about what they are to do in their circumstance. And so I think that's something that needs to be prayerfully discerned and prudentially determined with the help of good spiritual fathers. There are things that I, a layman sitting here, cannot at all do to affect sort of the meta problem. But there are things that I can do as a layman that can dramatically affect the life of my family, right? Or my local community and the sphere of influence that I have. So I think that's something that we should discern. Maybe it's my work on predestination, but I'm already a moderate pessimist, as it were, about the meta problem. So I guess I don't, because of my limited influence, I don't choose to focus on the meta problem directly. The second thing I would say is, coming back to the nature of liturgy in general, and in fact, it was, I believe, a conversation in Peter's dining room many years ago in Wyoming that first put me on this path of my research, is to realize that in the first place, our action in the liturgy is an act of religion, right? It's a part of justice, whereby we render unto God what is due to Him. And if we stop and think about that for a half second, and that infinite gift that God has given us, then this means that when it comes time to try to do an infinitesimally small thing, that we should in every action try and do the best, most worthy thing, so that we can render to God all the glory possible. So that's the second thing that I want to say. And then the third thing is to really return to the first half of the title of Peter's talk, and that is to talk about the weight and the authority of the tradition in showing to us what is the most worthy thing, right? Novelty can be easily cast away in the period of 25 or 50 or 100 years because it only took root in this place, but it was judged over multiple cultures or times or places to not be adequate. And yet that thing which endures, which is most worthy for the worship of God, is that which we've received from the tradition, yeah? So I think that whether we look to Pius V or whether we look to Aquinas or the Church Fathers, we see in all of these occasions, whether it's in resolving the Nestorian controversy with an appeal to the authority of the liturgy, or whether it is in liturgical reform to see a period of time of 200 years or more to establish a real authority of a new quote unquote liturgical rite. If we take the long view, we can see that we shouldn't be asking the question about minimalism or about legalities and parsing out which parts of the Mass is necessary for validity alone, but rather we should, out of love and out of the virtue of religion, seek to give the most worthy thing to our Lord.
So I think kind of as Peter, what you were talking about in your talk, really, is to actually offer, is that tradition is what balances to that, or doing what is right balances to that, correct?
Yes.
But I mean, the tradition is what is just simply fulfilling that.
Yes.
That's just the basic difference there. It's the idea of a novelty versus always to that was handed on. That, to your point, Chris, that box that was handed on from one generation to the next, you open the box up and do an invoice, you do an inventory on everything. Is it all there or is it not there? And if it's not there, then something happened when it got handed on.
Yeah, and just the simple point that the deposit of faith, what's in that box, is something that is also codified and embodied and transmitted through the liturgy. That's the traditional view of all Christians in all Eastern Western rites. And so any attack, I said this in my talk, but any attack on a traditional lex orandi, a traditional liturgical rite, is necessarily an attack on the Catholic faith as embodied and represented by that rite. And once you appreciate that, you can appreciate that we're not just talking about some kind of, as some people say, a merely disciplinary matter, like just a shift about what days you should fast on and what days you shouldn't fast on. It's much deeper than that, much more profound than that.
And be thinking, if you have questions for the panel, I think we're gonna start here in a moment with those questions. But maybe one last thing before we do move on to the audience. A lot of folks, and this kind of is what we talked about just a moment ago, but a lot of folks recently have put forth the idea that we could let the tradition go. We could, I'm not saying us, but what I'm saying is some people have written that the traditional Mass can go away if we can just magically make the Novus Ordo Latin, ad orientem, and a lot of smells and bells, and give us that perfect Novus Ordo, and then that's what would be acceptable to undo the tradition that's been passed on, or to let it all just go away. For the unique Roman rite, right? As tradition is sort of called it, the unique rite.
Can I start this time? Sure. Can you hear me? I don't know. Did I push a button? Is this still on? There's a great book. It's had a very, very low volume print, but I bet you can still find it by also a friend, Father Tom Kosick. It's called The Reform of the Reform, A Liturgical Debate. And it's sort of a Socratic dialogue, yeah? And it's so worth the read because it systematically dismantles this entire question. I mean, in every aspect, whether you want to sort of parse out how many prayers made its way unadulterated from one missal to the next, or any number of other things. So I just wanted to, that's the only thing I want to say is this is it's a lighthearted book, but it's full of factual information, and you should just own it. And he didn't pay me to promote his book.
Isn't he from Rhode Island too?
Yeah, he is actually a priest of the Diocese of Providence. Can I say, okay, so first of all, I actually met Father Kosick the very first time at my father's funeral, and I was like working on NLM at the time, and then the next time I met him was like a number of years later, and I'd become the editor, and I said to him, it's just like, great to have more articles from you because this is the problem that Peter and I have been struggling with for years, to get people to write. And he said, I just don't have anything else to say about the reform of the reform. So I do think that we must never despise efforts to improve the Novus Ordo. It is not going away anytime soon. That is just the reality of life. So, and we mustn't despise the efforts of good priests to celebrate it in a way that is more in keeping with the Catholic tradition and more in keeping with what the Second Vatican Council actually wanted to happen. So that is a thing which is capable of bearing good fruits, even if the only fruit that it bears is that you don't have to listen to the corpus of hymns that I grew up with, which were just the most, just absolutely atrocious things, or the ones that they're, as I said, using in Italy now. But there is always going to come a point where the reform of the reform will just kind of hit a wall, which is that there are simply riches that are an intrinsic part of the Roman Rite, and riches which the Second Vatican Council wanted us to have and wanted us to know better, and which were taken out. And there's a very simple example, Septuagesima, which is probably the one that we notice most because if you're as in one church, like in this church where you have two different rites being celebrated, then if you show up for the trad mass early enough that you see the priest coming out in green, and then the celebrant of the 11 o'clock comes out in violet. And there's absolutely nothing about Sacrosanctum Concilium that suggests in any way, shape, or form that should have been gotten rid of. There is a lot of stuff like that, and the reform of the reform is always going to hit that wall, that there's just all kinds of stuff about the post-conciliar rite where those riches were gotten rid of against the spirit and the letter of Sacrosanctum Concilium and against all prudence. And that just has to, and that was a big part of, the virtue of Summorum Pontificum was that it would enable the entire church to rediscover that.
Yeah, I just would add to that in one of the most important discoveries, not discoveries exactly, but arguments that's been made in the past 50 years is the I would call it now a rock-solid demonstration that the Novus Ordo, as it was given to us in 1969, does not fulfill the clearest parts of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Liturgy. There's no way that you can read that. Of course, the Constitution was written with all kinds of loopholes in it. We know that. It was written by, Bugnini was involved in writing it. He knew what he wanted. They knew what they wanted to do. So I'm not trying to absolve them or it of all responsibility, but simply saying that what was given does not match up with what the 2,147 Council Fathers signed and voted for. But just to piggyback on your comment, one of the walls, for example, that will be run up against is the Novus Ordo lectionary. The fact that there's so many suppressed verses in the new lectionary. So it has a lot more scripture, and therefore it gives you the impression that you're hearing more of the Bible, but you're having verses snipped out here and there, and it happens a lot, not just a few times. So you get Elijah the prophet. This came up recently because of Bishop Barron's comments about Elijah, right? When you hear the story of Elijah in the new lectionary, it conveniently silences the part about slaying the prophets of Baal, as if God shouldn't have said that, or as if it's dangerous for us to hear the word of God. And the new Liturgy of the Hours cuts out over 100 verses of Psalms, which has never happened any time in the history of the liturgy, right? That we would sort of figure out what psalm verses are healthy for people to use versus which ones God shouldn't have given to us, or that we're just too stupid or we're too immature or something to have these psalm verses, right? Just because they talk about God, smashing the heads of the wicked or something like that. Okay, well, fine. That's what God said. They should take that seriously, especially if we'd apply it to our own sins and to the demons and so on.
Oh, I remember it was at a liturgy conference. Don't go to those. There's some good ones. I'm going to go Sun Tzu on us here for half a second. I ran into Father Anthony Ruff at a dinner at one of these liturgy conferences, and he and I had been having an exchange, and and eventually we give up on these efforts. But walked up to him and struck up a conversation, because in vino veritas, and I said, Father, this will be the last thing I have to say on the subject. I earnestly hope that my funeral mass will be something like what the Second Vatican Council Fathers envisioned, and this was something that he and I could both agree on. Of course, we meant different things, but.
Yeah. Just one last comment, though. I agree with Gregory that, so Father Zuhlsdorf has a saying, "A rising tide lifts all boats." And what he means by that is any good efforts that the clergy are making to make the liturgy more sacred and more worthy of God, to go back to your earlier comment about religion, those are all good things. I just think that, and they're good because the liturgy is given to God. And if we know that it's better to worship, let's say, ad orientem for all kinds of reasons towards the east, if we know it's better to use authentic sacred music, if we know it's better to receive communion in the devout and reverent way of our forefathers, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow, then we should do those things because they're good to do and because God is honored by them. It would be a terrible thing to say, well, I've heard some traditionalists make the argument that the Novus Ordo, it's better when it's as bad as possible because then it drives people to the traditional Mass. I mean, I'm sorry. That's
a little cynical.
That's going too far, I think. That's going too far. But still, it's not just that you run up against the wall. It's that you just have to recognize that this is an interim solution. This is not a final solution. This is like putting a Band-Aid on a wound. But the wound is going to need surgery. It's going to need... it's going to need medicine and vitamins and cauterization and all kinds of things, right? The Band-Aid is not enough. And that's where I just, do the good, but recognize that the final goal has to be the restoration of the Roman tradition.
And I guess understand that Traditionis Custodes says the opposite, but that the final goal does need to be the restoration of tradition. And to Chris's point, within our own families, when we're blessed with the opportunities and the options, we can be homesteaders of tradition and not tourists, because we do have that opportunity. So that's something that we as a laity can decide to do. So should we maybe open it up to questions from the audience? I think, are we going to use this microphone over here? Two things I would ask real fast before we start the questions, which is if you choose to identify yourself, that's great, but do it without the whole biography that these gentlemen got, because I'm sure a lot of people want to ask questions. And let's, as much as we can, let's stay on maybe kind of the topic we're on right now, just because we can kind of get sideways and left and right and everything. But we want folks coming over?
Yeah, and also just so if anyone has questions, come over here, and then come up to the microphone. I'll adjust it in a second. But also, if the moderators or the panelists could repeat the question, just in case people didn't hear it, that would be most appreciative.
Okay. Yeah, we can do that for sure. So if there are any questions, if you want to just go ahead and go, watch up the camera.
Hi, I'm Doug from Greenville, South Carolina, and I have a question for Dr. K, but all of you can answer it. Do you ever get invited into seminaries? And if you do, is it to lecture or to debate? Is it only the handful of friendlies, or is that a way, is that going to be a major hurdle for being able to make inroads here, where you can't get to the new priests who, from my experience, are the more susceptible and open to being traditional?
Yes. Yeah, there was a famous...
So the question was, are you invited into seminaries?
Yes. There's a famous article by Matthew Schmitz with a great title. It's "The Kids Are Old Right." I wish I had come up with that one, but anyway. So the fact is that the younger generations, either they're very open to tradition or they're already reading stuff on the internet. I mean, they're reading New Liturgical Movement. And we know this because we see comments from seminarians, from young clergy. We get emails from them. I get emails on quite a regular basis from seminarians from all over the country, and actually all over the world too, from Europe especially. And so the fact is they're all thinking about it. You can't hide something as magnificent and beautiful as a solemn high mass. I mean, this is something I remember. Pray Tell, which is the progressive liturgy blog, the antithesis of New Liturgical Movement. They complained that if you
That's giving
search...
them way too much.
Well, yeah, right. They want to be that. But they were complaining once that when you type in mass into the internet, you mostly get traditional masses, right? And they're like, no, duh. I mean, this is like the beautiful. This is really the beautiful stuff. I mean, that's what everybody wants, right? I mean, that's what people respond to. So I don't get invited to. There's one exception that I was invited to a certain seminary to speak, and I was very well and warmly received there. But seminaries are hotbeds of officialdom, of the official line. What you get in most seminaries is sort of the bulletin from high command saying, this is what everybody should think like, here's how everyone should think, here's how everyone should speak, here's how everyone should dress, right? And so the official policy is always whatever the line is from the Vatican or from the USCCB. But secretly, the seminarians are talking about these things, reading about these things. So I actually have, along with Gregory, I have tremendous hopes for the future. Because right now, well, okay, I'll stop there because I don't want to steal any of your thunder.
Well, I'll just tell you one story. And again, it's the same experience because I've only been in the United States for 16 months now. But I know of a young man who got into serious trouble in his Italian seminary for praying praying the Liturgy of the Hours in Latin. In vain did he protest that he was not doing so. He was praying it in Italian. And the reason why he got in trouble was not because he was saying they just didn't want to hear it, but it was actually that his breviary was the same color. It was an older edition of the Italian, was the same color as the easily available Latin one. It's not a particularly nice color either, but whatever. And in the United States nowadays, for whatever else may be going on, that stuff just doesn't happen. So, you're just not going to hear anecdotes of those kinds of persecutions. That era has faded. And a lot of the people who are, even people who would like to do that sort of thing know that they can't really get away with it anymore. And this is not going to last.
Yeah, I've got a slightly different career path than both of these fine people, in that I've worked in and for and around the institutional church for most of my career, and I will agree with them that in some instances you do see and hear about, if we want to use the word persecution, a sort of a greater scrutiny of those who have a greater attachment to the beauty of the liturgy or to the old rite mass or whatever it might be. But by and large, things had already shifted under Benedict, and I think certainly continue to shift under the current pontificate. And that is a couple of things. One is, as that great article sort of says, that the younger generation really is just not at all engaged with the arguments of the previous generations. They don't have that baggage. They have a love and a desire for the salvation of souls. And that's a really important thing. And the second is a sort of a practical problem, and that is, in some dioceses, not this one, Deo gratias, there is a shortage of priests, and the replacement rate isn't quite what it needs to be, and so there's sort of become a toleration, at least a ceasefire, and not an explicit sort of combativeness over these things. The faith is one and has also many expressions, and my experience, I've seen some of the negative side of it. I've also seen a lot of really fantastic things happening in the most unlikely of places, including regular celebration of the traditional Mass in the seminaries here in America, and not only of the 62 Missal, but also the various rites, the Dominican rite and others as well. I'm actually really, really hopeful about the next generation of clergy. Yeah.
Good. Maybe we can take the next question.
First of all, thank you all for being here to present and include us in this discussion. So, and forgive the simplicity of my question. My husband and I are actually pretty new to the Latin Mass. We went for the first time about 3 years ago. And it has absolutely been amazing in allowing us to grow more in our faith and our marriage. I never expected that. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I just didn't know what I didn't know. Didn't know what I was missing. Having said that, I wouldn't consider us to be on, a part of a movement per se. We do recognize that there is a growing schism in what we know to be true and good, and what Pope Francis is saying. And we recognize that we might come to a time that we may have to make the choice of whether to be obedient or to resist, as has been put tonight. My primary concern is, as a Catholic, what I've always understood as our duty is to remain under, I guess, what I can call the umbrella of protection underneath the Catholic Church. If there is a point which we have to make a decision, and if our goal isn't, Latin Mass has to be it, or whatever. If our goal is, I want to remain under the protection of the Catholic Church, because as long as I remain under her protection, I can err and still be protected, or if I step out from that protection, or that umbrella of protection that we've been promised by the Holy Spirit, then I could be in the moral right, and yet I'm not under that protection any longer. If our goal is to stay under the protection of the Catholic Church, how do we know what that looks like? How do we know if it's to obey humbly, recognizing that God's ways are not our ways and we don't understand them? Or if we, resist, have we broken with the Catholic Church? How do we know if we're in the Catholic Church anymore?
So that's a lot to restate, but
Yeah.
more or less.
Sorry.
No, that's okay though. But so basically that discerning obedience to authority, and yet when correct or morally correct, or choosing something like resistance, the discernment of, is that putting you outside of the umbrella of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, so this obviously is a huge question, a very important question. My talk this evening was mainly to say, if the liturgy by which the Church lived and by which most of the great saints lived, if there's something really wrong with that, then the Catholic Church has just blown itself up, right? And so I don't believe that. I can't believe that. I can't allow myself to believe that if I actually still hold that the Church is true. And I actually have no doubts about that. My doubts are rather about Pope Francis and about Traditionis Custodes and that whole campaign. Now, we have helpful resources in our tradition. That's why I was quoting a bunch of Catholic theologians of high repute from past centuries to say there could be times when resistance is necessary, because you can know with conviction that certain things should never be rejected or should never be accepted. Let me just give an example, because liturgy is such a hot topic and people get very emotional about it, rightly so, I think. But right now, Humanae Vitae is under attack. I'm sure many of you have seen that in the news. There are theologians who are flying under the papal colors, so to speak, who are saying we can question whether contraception is immoral. I mean, that is an astonishing thing, and there's no question in Catholic tradition. You can find a unanimous teaching about this question going all the way back to the early centuries. So if somebody stands up, it's like Paul saying, if anybody preaches a gospel other than the one that you have received, let him be anathema. It doesn't matter who it is, let him be anathema, right? So I do think we have resources. I just want to mention, I did a podcast a few days ago with Timothy Flanders, and it's on 1 Peter 5, so you can find it on YouTube, 1 Peter 5 podcasts. And the specific topic of our conversation, which we got into a lot of detail about, was what are the times in church history when people legitimately resisted the Pope? And why did they do it, and what did it look like? So I would just recommend that to you, because it gives a lot of concrete examples of where that happened. I'll just throw one example out there. St. Athanasius of Alexandria, right? He was excommunicated by a pope Did he stop saying the liturgy? No. Right? I mean, and he's one of the greatest saints we have. And there are other saints too. I mean, anyway, so I won't go into too much detail, but just to say, we do have resources. We always have to remember this distinction that Journet and Maritain make between the church and churchmen. Churchmen are not the church. They can represent the church. They can sometimes speak on behalf of the church, but there shouldn't be a simple equal sign there. So, like, disagreeing with Pope Francis on the death penalty means I'm not a good Catholic. That's an invalid inference.
I want to take maybe a different tack. One of the unfortunate sort of consequences which Newman spoke about regarding the proclamation of papal infallibility, and he didn't disagree with of course, the doctrine, but rather the prudence of it and the timeliness of it. And then another great luminary of our current times has coined an amazing phrase, which is maybe even more specific. He talks about hyperpapalism. One of the things, it's that guy. But one of the things that that all this is sort of done is it's actually it's placed us out of order in the way that we have epistemic and even maybe even ontological contact with the church, right? We don't skip over our pastor and our bishop to arrive at the currently reigning pontiff, right? We don't go through subcommittees of the USCCB in order to have contact with the truths of the faith. Although, please God, more often than not, it's all mutually reinforcing each other. But, the question of obedience or disobedience, I would just sort of say, well, in my place where I'm at, am I having real contact with the faith which I know to have been passed on, integrally and without error, right? And if I do, then that should be a sign of great hope and not of worry, right? And if I don't, and we have many, and I know several of us have relocated, and we have many friends who haven't relocated and for decades or more are still in great anxiety about this precise question that you're asking about, yeah? And sometimes, we need to give up the goods of this world and maybe even move our whole family for the sake of our salvation and the good of our family souls somewhere else if we aren't getting that. But if we are, then all the more reason to build up our local church, our local community, the community of saints gathered here tonight, right? And to be a salt and light to the world here locally, right?
And remember, if you're carrying on as we've always carried on, then if you're doing this and all of a sudden somebody's doing that, you stay the course. So, thank you so much for your question.
Hey, thank you all for being here. I'm grateful for the last question because it kind of touched on a lot that I was going to say. So, very fortuitous. But to elaborate on it a little further, how do we contextualize evangelization and maybe even conversion within a divided liturgical environment when you might imagine that some virtues and graces and blessings of the church seem to be more, it's difficult to say the exact word, but more available in one environment or another? How does the Catholic sense of unity in the body of Christ assert itself in that kind of environment? And lastly, I appreciate someone mentioned truth precedes unity, which is a good touch point for this question, I think.
Oh, I forgot that. So basically, the idea of evangelization, you have an environment with both masses, both the new rite and the old rite, and how do you basically proceed with this idea of, I guess, unity as being a part of that evangelization process, and then you acknowledge obviously that truth having much more of a foundational role than unity, really in that maybe evangelization process.
Yeah. The answer to that question, how do you proceed, is badly. I mean, the problem is real. It has to be resolved. I'm not saying that it will be resolved anytime soon, but it has to be resolved, that we cannot go along forever with a liturgical reform that is in and of itself, promoted as the fulfillment of the will of an ecumenical council. An ecumenical council is not, it's not like the PTA. I mean, it's an important thing in the life of the church. So you cannot go along with a liturgy that is purported to be the fulfillment of the will of an ecumenical council, which is actually the rejection of the will of an ecumenical council. You cannot go along with a liturgy which is, so contrary to so many traditions and excises so many things that there was no reason to excise. So ultimately, this problem does have to be resolved at some point. And I think that, just like give an example, I was just also talking with Timothy Flanders, because it's a small world, about one of the something that was taken out of one of the prayers, which is a petition to God to mortify all of our vices. So the question which we should be asking ourselves is, if we used to pray every year on a particular feast in a particular context to mortify our vices, and then that God obviously help us mortify our vices, and then we stop praying that, what does that say about unity within the church? Because the church doesn't just exist now, it exists in all time. So what does that say about our unity with our ancestors? And how can we say that we don't want God to mortify our vices anymore? So that's where the real compromise of evangelization comes. So, in a way, it's probably a good thing to maybe people don't know that. But the problem has to be fixed. So, and until it's fixed, we will live in this state of unhappy compromise.
Yeah, I think one analogy that I'll preface the analogy with the statement that I am firmly convinced that as Catholics, we cannot hold that any of the new sacramental rites, or really any of the liturgical rites whatsoever, contain positive heresy or error. Actually, I've studied these things very carefully for decades, and I've never found anything that looks like an error. What you do find are omissions, ambiguities, boredom. You find other kinds of problems, but you don't find positive error and heresy. And so that's important just as a baseline, because sometimes you hear people throw around the term indefectibility, and they want to get a lot out of this word, indefectibility. But I'm with John Henry Newman. I love John Henry Newman. He's the greatest modern theologian in many ways. And he says, the Catholic Church has only ever required of her members a minimal interpretation of any dogmatic statement. That is, what is the minimum that this is asking of me? Not what is the maximum that you might extrapolate out of it if you're a clever and imaginative theologian, but what's the minimum that this is committing me to? And the minimum that indefectibility commits us to is to say the Church of Christ will never positively enforce error or vice upon her members. I think that's the meaning of indefectibility right there. It doesn't mean your National Episcopal Conference is not going to go down the drain because Henry VIII's did, right? There are plenty of, it doesn't mean that your local church is going to survive because the one in North Africa didn't when the Muslims swept through and destroyed it. So indefectibility should be given, in light of history and theology, a minimum meaning. So all that being said, the image that helps me is to say, the church, for various reasons, largely sociological and theological in nature, in the 1960s especially, thought that she would reach modern men better by providing a different kind of liturgical meal for them. And what was provided was a very simplified modern meal of maybe one course and a drink, kind of like a Happy Meal. Maybe I shouldn't use that. But this is some kind of very simple thing, because modern people don't like complicated things. They don't like, 8-course French cuisine or whatever. They want something simple and quick and whatever. Well, that you can still get nourishment from that. But the church also in her tradition provided the multi-course, deluxe, wonderfully prepared, traditional cuisine, right? And that's what she gave us, and that's what is still available. And I think God is never going to take that away because he wants us to have the best and not just the least and the minimum. And so in a way, yes, you can evangelize in either scenario, but one is like limping and the other is like running. One of them is maybe just enough, and the other is a superabundance, right? And Christ says, I came that they may have life in abundance, right? That's what he wants. He wants the abundance for us.
Right. Greg mentioned that unity isn't just a current generation. So we have to be unified with the community of saints and with all those before us as well. As Catholics, we should understand that, right? The unity isn't just in the moment with whatever the church is saying in the moment. I think do we have two more questions? I think we need to make these the last two, right? Last two questions then, I think, because we're at 9 o'clock.
Hello. Thank you very much for putting this on. And specifically, Dr. Kwasniewski, thank you for your talk, which I found to be very good, very clarifying on a number of things. And this question is directed specifically to you and to a few, some of the things you mentioned, and it's really a question of clarification. So, and rather than speaking of the, merits or lack thereof of the Novus Ordo Mass or any of the modern forms of the sacramental rites or even the question of obedience, but really the question of authority. And specifically, if you could clarify the distinction between doctrine and discipline when it comes to the power that the church has and its own magisterium, and particularly the Holy Father, in terms of making adjustments or modifications to discipline specifically. And I think, for example, quo primum in 1570 and the abolishing of all rites younger than 200 years in instituting what we now know as the Tridentine form of the Mass. So up to that time, these were legitimate expressions of the, lex credendi that at that point were rendered obsolete by the magisterium of the church in order to make way for a more, universal form. And so I guess just in terms of clarification, where might the lines be drawn in terms of what is the power of the magisterium in distinguishing between doctrine and discipline in the matter of liturgy specifically, which it seems comes under that under the umbrella of discipline largely.
So I think the question really is the question of authority and the authority of the Pope, of the Holy Father, to change the liturgy, or how it falls under his authority. You're saying 1570, same thing with Trent and abolishment of rites that were less than 200 years old.
And I just want to clarify something about that before, just to make sure the question is resting on the right foundations. If you go to Father Hunnick's blog,
Right.
he has written a lot of really good stuff about that. We don't really know exactly why they chose 200 years. They didn't write it down at the time why that was the benchmark. However, it is generally believed by reputable scholars that the precise reason why they chose that was to get right behind Wycliffe, the end of Wycliffeism.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So that we're not talking about the abolition of solid expressions of the lex credendi, quite the opposite. And then that why the 200-year mark. This would not have involved a lot of suppression of stuff
Right.
that anybody was particularly attached to. It was not to create a universal right. It was to purify, it was to get rid of things that they considered to be very iffy. Just to make sure that, because the reason why this is very important is to understand is that it was in no way Pius V's intention to say this is a legitimate expression of the lex orandi, but nevertheless we are getting rid of it for the sake of the imposition of a universal right. And this is a very common misunderstanding about this. So on that basis...
Yeah.
Before you start, Peter, I think we're going to have to make this one the last question. I'm sorry. Just because Dr. Kwasniewski needs to get some books signed too as well. And we're kind of wrapping it up here. So I think this will be the last question. I'm sorry.
No, and that's really important because there's a lot of frankly lying going on about that, where where it's being said that Pius V abolished all kinds of things, and therefore Francis can do the same thing. No, that's not at all what Pius V did. He said, if it's older than 200 years, it should not be abolished. The Novus Ordo is 50 years old? Okay. And if there's a unanimous vote of a particular bishop and his cathedral chapter, then they could freely choose to adopt the Roman rite. It was never imposed on anyone who was using a traditional rite. Why is that important? Because the argument in Quo Primum of Pius V, if you look at that, is you can't understand that if you think about the liturgy as only disciplinary. It's because the traditional Roman liturgy fully enshrines the Catholic faith against the errors of the Protestants that Pius V therefore canonizes it. I prefer to use that expression, canonizes. That is, he establishes it as a canon, as a regula fidei for the church. And so it might be possible to say a pope could institute a new rite as long as it's orthodox, but he could not abolish a traditional rite because the traditional rite is a canon or regula fidei, right? And that would bring with it all the difficulties that I mentioned. Now, you asked, is there a way to, is there sort of a rule of thumb we can use to say, well, the Pope can do this much, but not that much? Well, no, there's not a rule of thumb, and the reason is that there is no written constitution for the Catholic Church. Jesus didn't hand a written constitution to St. Peter and say, here are the things you can do and here are the things you can't do. So how do we know what the Pope can do and not do? Well, I mean, very interestingly enough, the popes have, generally speaking, if you look at all 266 popes, they have generally simply been content to repeat the faith that they received. That's what they saw as their main job. Newman described the papacy as a remora. Is that how you say it? Or remora? Remora. As a barrier, as an obstacle to change. In fact, Rome had a reputation of being theologically uninteresting because all the exciting theology was going on elsewhere, and Rome was just kind of waiting to see how things worked out and then would either approve or condemn, right? So that's actually the traditional understanding of the papacy, receiving, guarding, protecting, judging. However, popes in the prudential and disciplinary sphere, they would float trial balloons, or they would make actions, they would do things, and based on the reaction to those things, if everybody allowed them to do it, then that became a kind of precedent. And then a future pope could say, well, my predecessor did X, Y, and Z, and therefore I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and PDQ. And then if bishops said, no, X, Y, and Z is fine, but not PDQ, then the Pope would usually either drop that or his successors would drop that. There's a really important article about that just recently by Philip Campbell on Gregory VII. I highly recommend it. It appeared just about a week ago at 1 Peter 5, where Philip Campbell pointed out that Pope Gregory VII, he wrote a document called Dictatus Papae, and another document too, which has a longer Latin title that I can't remember, that made really outrageous claims for the papacy. And there were many bishops and a whole episcopal conference, well, they didn't have episcopal conferences, a whole episcopacy of Lombardy that said, no, you're going too far, we don't accept this is not traditional doctrine. And guess what? The successors of Gregory VII never did what he did, and they never repeated what he repeated. So that's actually where resistance is clearly part of God's providence, to say, no, you've gone too far. And so what is this too far? What does it look like? Well, I think in the end, we have to say, we all know the difference between a haircut and decapitation, right? and we all know the difference between a manicure and an amputation, right? And so, what is that line? It's hard to say, but I'll recognize it when it happens. And certainly with something like, okay, you can have a pretty intense debate about Pius XII's changes to Holy Week. I personally think they were a disaster, and so does my colleague here, and that's why we think that the pre-55 Holy Week should be restored along with the Tridentine Rite of which it's a part. You can have more intense debates about that question than you can about the question of should the entire traditional Roman Rite be put into the freezer, and or sent to outer space, So it seems to me that there's a question there of, that's why I talked about common sense, and in a way the sense is fidei, right?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, I think on that note, actually, I believe we're out of time, actually. We're at 9:15. Okay. We kind of ran long here. So let's go ahead. I think we're going to wrap it up. But Dr. Kwasniewski will be available at the table if you have further questions, right? You'll be signing books too?
Yes.
Absolutely. So if we could just thank the panel for their time.